I came home early to my mansion, only to find the HOA's Karen living in it, calling the cops on me and exposing herself in the process. The drive home had been long, but Mark didn't mind. For weeks, he had been buried in hotel conference rooms, airport lounges, and endless negotiations that stretched late into the night. His business trip overseas had ended ahead of schedule, a rare gift, and the thought of surprising his wife and kids filled him with a quiet sense of excitement. The familiar winding road leading up to Ridgecrest Hills, the exclusive gated community perched above the valley, came into view as the sun began to set. The glow of the horizon painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns. For Mark, this sight had always carried the same comfort, security, stability, and the reward of all his hard work. But tonight felt different. As his sleek black sedan rounded the last curve, his mansion appeared in the distance. It was a sight that usually filled him with pride, the sprawling stone and glass estate, framed by towering oaks and a private circular driveway. Yet what caught his attention was not the grandeur of the home, but the unfamiliar clutter in front of it. Several cars lined the driveway and even spilled onto the road's edge. Not the vehicles of close friends or family he would recognize instantly, but a scattering of sedans, SUVs, and pickup trucks with license plates he didn't know. His brow furrowed. Guests. That didn't make sense. His wife hadn't mentioned hosting anyone, and they rarely had surprise visitors without planning weeks in advance. He slowed the car, pulling up behind a dusty SUV parked crookedly on the edge of the lawn. The mansion's lights glowed warmly, every window illuminated, as though some kind of gathering was happening inside. A faint thrum of music reached him even through the car's closed windows, low, bass-heavy, not the kind of music his family usually played. Mark's stomach tightened. He stepped out of the car, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel, and paused for a moment to take it in. He tried to steady his breath. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe his wife had organized a surprise party to celebrate his early return. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he dismissed it. She wasn't the type. And their children, two teenagers buried in their own worlds, weren't capable of pulling off something this elaborate without slipping up. No, this was something else. Mark's footsteps echoed as he climbed the wide stone steps leading to the front door. He stopped just short of the entryway, peering through the glass panel. Inside, laughter rang out. People moved through the living room with drinks in hand, chatting casually, some sitting comfortably on his expensive leather couches, others leaning against the grand piano he had imported from Italy. Strangers. Not a single face was familiar. His heart began to pound and his hand instinctively tightened into a fist. This was his house, his sanctuary, and it looked as though it had been invaded. Pushing the door open slowly, Mark stepped inside. The cool rush of the air conditioning hit him, along with the stronger pulse of the music. No one immediately noticed his entrance, too caught up in their conversations and drinks. The sight was surreal, strangers lounging in his home as if it belonged to them. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath. Finally, one of the guests, a man in his late 30s with a smug expression, spotted him. He nudged another person beside him and pointed. A few heads turned. The chatter dipped into an awkward silence, and one woman set her glass down a little too quickly. Mark's voice was sharp, commanding, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Who are you people? Why are you in my house?" The silence deepened. Some exchanged nervous glances, others suddenly found the floor interesting, but no one offered an explanation. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears. He strode forward into the center of the room, his presence cutting through the uneasy crowd. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of his wife or children. Nowhere. Panic stirred at the edges of his thoughts. "Where's my family?" His voice rose, filled with an edge of fury. From the back of the group, a man emerged. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with slick-back gray hair and a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the casual chaos of the gathering. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged everywhere he stepped. "Ah, Mr. Cole," the man said smoothly, as if greeting an acquaintance rather than the furious homeowner standing before him. "Welcome back." Mark's jaw clenched. "Who the hell are you?" The man smiled faintly, as if amused by the question. "Name, Victor Hale. We're friends of the Ridgecrest community. We're here because the HOA allowed it." "The HOA?" Mark's voice was cold. "The HOA doesn't own this house. I do." Victor's smile didn't falter. "Yes, of course. But you see, there have been complaints about your absence, about certain community obligations. So we took the liberty of using the property for a gathering. Nothing permanent, just a little arrangement." Mark felt a chill sweep through him, colder than the air conditioning. His absence had given them an opening, and they had taken it. Strangers, sanctioned by the very HOA he'd always suspected of overreaching, were now lounging in his home. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Get out, every last one of you, now." The room shifted uneasily. Some guests began murmuring, already moving toward the door, but Victor didn't flinch. His gaze locked with Mark's, calm and unyielding. "You'll find," Victor said slowly, "that things in Ridgecrest don't always work the way you think. This community has rules, and sometimes those rules outweigh ownership papers." Mark's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay composed. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a strategist, someone who had clawed his way up by dismantling rivals who underestimated him. And standing here in the middle of his own home, he realized the battle lines had just been drawn. The last of the murmuring guests filed past him toward the door, casting wary glances at Victor as they left. Soon, it was just the two of them in the quiet, dimly lit living room. Mark leaned forward slightly, his words cutting like a blade. "You made a mistake, Victor. A big one. This is my house, my family, my life. And if you think I'm going to let you or your little HOA thieves take that away from me," he paused, his eyes narrowing, "you've got another thing coming." Victor only smiled again, a predator's smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving the faintest echo of his cologne behind. Mark stood there in the silence, fists clenched at his sides, the weight of what he had just walked into pressing hard against his chest. His family was safe, he was sure of it, but his home, his fortress, had been violated. And Mark Cole was not a man who let violations go unanswered. This wasn't just the return from a business trip. This was the beginning of a war. Mark gripped the handle of his suitcase tighter as his eyes locked on the flicker of movement behind the second-story curtains. For a moment, he thought exhaustion from his long trip was playing tricks on him. The house was supposed to be empty, his wife and kids visiting her sister out of town, the mansion left in silence until his return. But no, the silhouette was real. Someone was in there. He dropped the suitcase on the polished marble floor, the thud echoing through the cavernous entryway. His pulse quickened. The figure wasn't rushing or hiding like a burglar might. Instead, the curtain slid slightly to the side, revealing a poised, deliberate stance. It wasn't a thief. It was someone who wanted to be seen. And then he saw her face. Karen Bishop. The name alone was enough to make Mark's stomach twist with distaste. She was infamous in Ridgecrest Hills. Every homeowner knew her, not because they wanted to, but because she made herself unavoidable. As the president of the HOA, Karen had styled herself as the unchallenged ruler of the neighborhood, strutting through board meetings like a monarch among peasants. She was the type who could weaponize a smile, dressing up her venom in politeness before stabbing it into anyone who crossed her. Mark had clashed with her once before, a year earlier, over something minor, trash bins left out past collection day. He had been out of town on business then too, and his wife had forgotten to bring them in. By the time he returned, Karen had plastered violation notices across the mailbox, the front door, even on the garage. 3 notices in less than 24 hours, each with escalating threats of fines. He'd laughed it off then, treating it as a nuisance rather than a battle. But deep down, he had noted the look in her eyes at that HOA meeting afterward, the way she had smirked when she declared, "Rules are rules, Mr. Cole. Nobody is above them, not even you." Now, standing inside his home and staring up at her in the window, that smirk was back. Mark felt heat rise in his chest, rage pushing against his composure. He stormed up the staircase 2 steps at a time, the polished oak railing rattling under his grip. His shoes pounded against the steps, each one heavier, louder. He reached the landing and turned down the hall, every nerve in his body coiled like a spring. The door to the guest bedroom was slightly ajar. He pushed it open hard, and it slammed against the wall with a crack. There she was. Corinne Bishop stood in front of the window, arms crossed, wearing a pale gray suit tailored within an inch of its life. She looked out of place, as if she had stepped directly from a boardroom into his sanctuary. On the dresser beside her sat a half-empty glass of red wine, as if she had been waiting here comfortably for some time. "Corinne," Mark growled, his voice low, dangerous. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled thinly, tilting her head. "Mark Cole, back early, I see. I must admit you're full of surprises." "You didn't answer my question." His fists clenched at his sides. "Why are you in my home?" Corinne moved away from the window, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she approached. "You've been away," she said casually, as though discussing the weather. "And when the head of the household is absent, sometimes the community needs to step in." His eyes narrowed. "Step in? This isn't community property. This is my house. You had no right." "Rights?" she repeated, almost laughing. "You think this is about rights? Mark, this is about responsibility. For months, your property has been under scrutiny. Non-compliance here, neglected dues there, violations piling up. You've made it very clear you believe you don't have to answer to Ridgecrest Hills." "That's because I don't." His voice sharpened. "The HOA has no authority inside these walls. You and your board are parasites living off intimidation and paperwork, but you crossed the line tonight." Corinne's smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by a flicker of irritation, but she masked it quickly. "Lines are drawn differently here, and you'll find they bend when the HOA decides they do." Mark stepped closer, towering over her. The air between them bristled with unspoken threats. "Get out now." For the first time, Corinne's composure cracked. Her eyes flicked toward the wine glass, then back to him. But instead of leaving, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You're in over your head, Mark. You think you're powerful because you have money, because you own this mansion on the hill. But Ridgecrest Hills isn't yours. It belongs to the association. And if you keep fighting us, we'll strip everything from you piece by piece, until you're begging for our mercy." Mark's teeth ground together. He could feel the sharp edge of his temper ready to break free, but he forced himself to stay still, calculating. This wasn't just trespassing. This was a message. She wanted him rattled. She wanted him to feel powerless in his own home. But she had underestimated him. "Get out before I drag you out," he said finally, his voice deadly calm. Corinne studied him for a long moment, then let out a soft laugh. She picked up her glass, finished the wine in a slow sip, and set it down deliberately. "Very well, I'll leave. But remember this moment, Mark. Remember who stood in your house and told you the truth. The HOA isn't going anywhere, and neither am I." With that, she walked past him, her perfume lingering as she moved down the hall. Her heels clicked in perfect rhythm on the stairs until the sound faded at the front door. Moments later, the heavy slam of the door echoed through the mansion, leaving only silence behind. Mark stood motionless for a long time, every muscle in his body tense. His mind replayed her words over and over, each one twisting deeper like a knife. He knew Corinne Bishop wasn't just making empty threats. She was declaring war. And now she had made it personal. Mark turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the guest room she had invaded. Everything looked the same as before, the neatly folded linens, the untouched furniture. But it felt contaminated, violated. This was his home, his fortress, and Karen had walked inside without fear, as though she already owned it. He exhaled sharply, trying to calm the storm inside him. But beneath his controlled exterior, one thing was certain. She had drawn first blood. And Mark Cole was not a man who lost wars. For a moment, Mark thought Karen might finally leave. The empty wine glass sat on the dresser, her perfume still clinging to the air as she moved past him toward the hallway. He stood rigid, jaw clenched, listening to each deliberate click of her heels on the polished floorboards. But just as she reached the top of the stairs, she stopped. Instead of descending, she slowly turned to face him again. Her lips curled into that smug, knowing smile, the one that made every neighbor in Ridgecrest Hills loathe her. "You really think you can order me out of my community?" she asked softly, almost sweetly. "You still don't understand, Mark. You don't call the shots here." Before he could respond, Karen slipped her phone from her blazer pocket. The device gleamed under the chandelier's light as she raised it to her ear. Mark felt his stomach knot. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Karen pressed a finger to her lips as though silencing a child. Then she spoke, her voice rising with manufactured panic. "Yes, hello, this is Karen Bishop. I need officers dispatched immediately. There's a man trespassing in my home. He's aggressive, threatening me. Please hurry." Mark's blood ran cold. "Your home," he repeated, his voice rough with disbelief. "You're calling them to my house and claiming." She turned her back to him, ignoring his words entirely, layering her tone with sobs and hysteria. "Yes, Ridgecrest Hills. The mansion on the hill. Please hurry, I'm scared for my life." Rage flared inside Mark's chest like a wildfire. He stormed forward, ripping the phone from her hand, but she let it go willingly, as though she had expected him to. The call was already made, the lie already planted. "You're insane," Mark growled, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. "This is my house, you're trespassing. You've crossed every line there is." Karen didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped closer, eyes glittering with dangerous satisfaction. "And when the police arrive, who do you think they'll believe? The upstanding HOA president, or the man they find cornering her in a guest bedroom, holding her phone?" Her words hung in the air like venom. Mark's chest rose and fell heavily. He could almost hear the distant wail of sirens already, imagined or real, he couldn't be sure. His mind raced. If the police came barreling through the gates now, what would they see? A woman in a suit, flushed cheeks and feigned tears, claiming victimhood, and him towering, furious, holding her phone. He cursed under his breath and hurled the phone onto the bedspread. It bounced once, the screen still glowing with the open 911 call before finally dimming. Karen's smirk returned, wider than before. "You see, Mark, you may have your money, you may have your mansion, but power—" She leaned in until her lips were inches from his ear. "Power is perception, and I control that." The sound of tires crunching gravel outside cut through the silence. Mark stiffened. This time it wasn't imagined. Flashing red and blue lights pulsed against the window pane, painting the walls in alternating streaks of color. Karen stepped back satisfied, right on time. Mark's stomach churned with fury as the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the driveway. A commanding voice barked from outside. "Police! Open the gate!" Karen lifted her chin. "Shall we greet them together?" Mark shoved past her, his strides heavy with barely contained rage. Down the staircase he went, the chandelier swaying slightly from the force of his movement. He hit the marble entryway and glanced at the wall monitor. The security feed displayed 3 squad cars lined at his wrought iron gate, their lights piercing the night. Officers stood shoulder to shoulder, hands resting on their belts, and at the front, a sergeant he recognized, Officer Hale. a man Mark had seen before at community events, often chatting amiably with Corinne at HOA fundraisers. Of course. Mark pressed the intercom. This is Mark Cole. What's the meaning of this? The sergeant's voice crackled back through the speaker, firm and uncompromising. We received a call reporting a trespasser and possible domestic disturbance. Open the gate, sir. Mark's fists balled at his sides. His own home, his own gate, and he was being commanded like a criminal. Behind him, Corinne descended the stairs gracefully, placing one hand delicately on the banister as though she were the lady of the house. Her expression was perfection, half panic, half gratitude, as she prepared to play her part. Mark, she whispered loudly enough for the intercom to catch, please, don't make this worse. Let them in. The sergeant's voice hardened. Mr. Cole, failure to comply will escalate this situation. Open the gate. Mark stared at the monitor, teeth grinding. His instincts screamed to fight, to demand warrants and proof. But he could already see where this was heading. A refusal would only feed Corinne's performance. She would play the frightened victim while the police forced their way in. Taking a steadying breath, he tapped the panel. The iron gates groaned, swinging open slowly as the patrol cars rolled up the driveway, their beams slicing across his lawn. The officers entered the foyer minutes later, boots squeaking against the marble, their presence overwhelming the space. Hale stepped forward, his eyes flicking briefly to Corinne, then back to Mark. Sir, Hale began, we received a call that you were unlawfully occupying this residence and threatening Ms. Bishop. Mark's laugh was humorless, sharp. Unlawfully occupying, this is my house, I own it outright, she's the trespasser. Corinne stepped forward with a trembling performance that would make an actress proud. He grabbed my phone, she said softly, voice breaking. He was so angry, I didn't know what he might do. The officer's eyes darted between them. Mark could feel the suspicion aimed squarely at him. Years of building his empire, running his businesses, his reputation, all of it teetered in this moment on the edge of perception, just as Corinne had promised. Check the deed, Mark snapped, his voice cutting. My name on it, hers isn't. And if you're here to enforce HOA fantasies, let me remind you, the law doesn't bend for Corinne Bishop. The tension in the room thickened. Hale raised a hand to silence him, then turned to another officer. Verify ownership. As the officer moved to the computer in the patrol car outside, Corinne clutched her chest, playing her role to the hilt. He's dangerous, Sergeant. He can buy whatever he wants, but he thinks that means he owns people too. The whole neighborhood is afraid of him. Mark's nostrils flared, fury simmering hotter by the second, but he forced himself to remain still. Any sudden movement would be twisted against him. Minutes crawled by before the verifying officer returned, nodding to Hale. The properties registered to Mark Cole, paid in full. Relief surged through Mark, but Hale's expression remained unreadable. He turned to Corinne. Ma'am, do you have any proof of residence here? Corinne's eyes welled with crocodile tears. Not on me, but the HOA has records. He's been in violation for months. I only came here tonight to address the ongoing issues, and he exploded. Mark barked a laugh. Address issues by drinking wine in my guest room. Hale's jaw tightened. He studied both of them, clearly aware that the situation wasn't as black and white as Corinne wanted it to be. Still, she had succeeded in her goal. She had dragged his name through the mud in front of law enforcement, planting seeds of doubt, framing herself as the victim. Here, what's going to happen, Hale said finally, his tone clipped. Ms. Bishop will leave the property immediately, and Mr. Cole will be filing an incident report. Any further disturbances and this goes to the county. Corinne gasped, feigning shock. So he gets away with it just like that. Hale shot her a sharp look. Ma'am, out now. Corinne's mask cracked for a fraction of a second, annoyance flashing in her eyes, but she recovered quickly. With a dramatic sigh, she gathered her blazer, lifted her chin and strode toward the door. As she passed Mark, she leaned close enough that only he could hear. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." The door shut behind her, the echo lingering like a threat. Mark stood frozen in the middle of his entryway, the flashing police lights still strobing across the walls. He knew Karen had lost this round, technically, but she had succeeded in showing her hand. She could twist reality, she could weaponize perception, and she had the connections to make the police appear at his doorstep with one phone call. For the first time since moving into Ridgecrest Hills, Mark felt the true depth of her reach. And as the officers filed out, leaving him in silence once again, he made a quiet vow. If Karen Bishop wanted a war, she had just declared it. And Mark Cole never lost a war. The flashing red and blue lights from the patrol cars washed over the mansion's immaculate stone driveway, giving the scene an almost surreal glow. Mark stood at the center of it, shoulders squared, suitcase still at his side like an unspoken reminder. He had just returned home. This was his house, his sanctuary, his hard-earned reward for years of sacrifice. Yet now, with police officers surrounding him, it felt like a battlefield. Karen's shrill voice broke the silence. "Don't listen to him. He's lying. He doesn't live here." She jabbed a manicured finger toward Mark, her tone as venomous as ever. Her confidence hadn't wavered since the moment she called the cops. If anything, it had grown stronger now that she had an audience. Mark calmly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather folder. He opened it with deliberate precision and handed over his driver's license and a thick envelope of paperwork. "My name is Mark Halloway," he said, voice even but firm. "This is my property. The deed, the mortgage documents, the utility accounts, they're all under my name." The taller of the two officers, Officer Daniels, took the paperwork and began leafing through it with a furrowed brow. His partner, Officer Ruiz, hovered closer to Karen, as if gauging her reaction. Karen scoffed. "Do you honestly believe a few papers prove anything? He could have forged those." Her eyes glinted with desperation masked as arrogance. "I've been living here for weeks with permission. The HOA knows about it. He abandoned the property when he left for his so-called trip." Mark's jaw tightened. "Abandoned? I was on a business trip. I own this house outright. You don't have permission. You've trespassed, Karen. You've broken into my home." Ruiz stepped in, his tone measured but serious. "Ma'am, do you have any paperwork, anything at all, that proves you have the right to be here?" Karen faltered for just a split second, her hand twitching at her side. Then she recovered with a smug smirk. "The HOA board gave me the right. They said the property was in violation of community guidelines. I was placed here to oversee compliance." Mark let out a sharp laugh, cold, incredulous. "Oversee compliance? You moved into my house, parked your cars in my driveway, and pretended you owned the place. That's not compliance, that's theft." Daniels, still flipping through Mark's documents, gave a low whistle. "These look legitimate. Deed matches the county seal, mortgage is clear, ID lines up with the records." He turned to Ruiz. "I think we've got our homeowner." Karen's face twisted, her practiced veneer starting to crack. She raised her voice, almost shrieking. "No, you don't understand. He can't just come back and throw me out. I've already established residency." "Residency?" Mark repeated, stepping forward. His voice dropped into a tone that carried more weight than anger, it carried finality. "Karen, you're nothing more than a squatter. You had no lease, no agreement, no permission. The only thing you've established is a history of harassment, and believe me, I have plenty of proof of that." The officers exchanged glances. Ruiz cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you can't produce any legal documentation, this isn't your residence. The homeowner has provided proof of ownership." Karen wasn't ready to give up. She turned her fury on the officers now. "Do you have any idea who I am? I run this neighborhood. I can have your jobs for this. This entire property is under the jurisdiction of the HOA, and as president, my word carries weight. If I say this house violates rules, then it violates rules." Mark shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Your jurisdiction ends at the property line, Karen. HOA rules don't give you the right to occupy someone else's home. This house is mine, always has been, always will be." For a moment, silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant hum of crickets and the flashing lights reflecting off Karen's pale, furious face. Daniels finally spoke. "Here, how this is going to work. Ma'am, you're leaving the premises tonight. If you refuse, you'll be removed by force for trespassing. Mr. Holloway will file a report in case you wish to pursue charges." Karen's composure shattered. She lunged forward, pointing a trembling finger at Mark. "This isn't over. You think you can just walk back in here and take everything back? You'll regret crossing me, Mark. The HOA won't let you get away with this." Mark bent down, picked up his suitcase, and walked past her without flinching. "You made one mistake, Karen," he said over his shoulder, his voice low and edged with steel. "You thought you could steal from me, but this house, this land, it isn't yours to control. And when I'm done, neither is this neighborhood." The officers guided Karen toward the driveway, her protests echoing into the night. Neighbors had begun peeking out from behind their curtains, watching the scene unfold, whispering in hushed tones. For years, Karen had ruled with intimidation, making herself untouchable. But tonight, in front of everyone, the mask had slipped. Inside, Mark closed the heavy oak doors of his mansion and exhaled, his chest tight with a mixture of rage and relief. His sanctuary had been violated, his name dragged through the mud, but the battle wasn't finished. He knew Karen, and the HOA she commanded wouldn't go quietly. Tonight was only the beginning. Mark's footsteps echoed against the marble floors as he stepped deeper into his mansion. Each corner, each room carried a strange unease, as though the house itself had been violated, stripped of its dignity. What he saw next made his blood boil. The kitchen, once pristine, was cluttered with wine glasses, empty bottles, and platters crusted with food remnants. Expensive cheeses he had imported from Europe were left out, hardened and spoiled. The air carried a faint but unmistakable odor of stale wine, perfume, and something worse, entitlement. He moved to the dining room. His mahogany table, crafted by hand and polished over years, was scratched and stained. At the center sat a gaudy floral arrangement in a plastic vase that wasn't his. Around it, HOA pamphlets, stacks of paperwork, and sticky notes littered the space. He picked one up. Agenda: raise fines for late landscaping. Discuss parking permits. And scrawled across another. Reminder: Mark's property must remain under review. His fists clenched. She had turned his dining room into her command center. Moving into the lounge, his eyes narrowed. Karen had draped one of his silk robes across the couch, the fabric creased as though it had been worn carelessly. On the side table sat a nearly empty bottle of his best scotch, reserved for rare occasions, and two lipstick-stained glasses. His pulse quickened. She hadn't just lived here, she had hosted guests. The evidence mounted as he climbed the winding staircase, his hand grazing the polished banister. Upstairs, the master bedroom door stood ajar. He hesitated for a moment, bracing himself before stepping inside. His sanctuary, the room he guarded more than any other, looked like a stranger's quarters. Drawers had been opened, his neatly folded clothes tossed carelessly aside. One of his monogrammed shirts hung from the back of a chair, wrinkled and stained with makeup. His bed, a space that symbolized rest and privacy, was unmade, the sheets tangled and perfumed with a scent he recognized instantly, Karen's heavy floral fragrance. He stood frozen, the violation sinking into his bones. His jaw tightened, breath ragged. This wasn't just an intrusion. This was possession. She had claimed what was his. On the dresser, he noticed photos. His photos. Except someone had moved them, tilted them, rearranged them, as if deciding which memories were worth keeping. His late parents' anniversary picture had been shoved aside, half hidden behind a cheap candle Corinne had clearly brought from her own home. The final insult came when he opened his walk-in closet. Rows of shoes, her shoes, lined the floor. Dresses hung alongside his suits. She had colonized his space, not just physically but symbolically too. Mark staggered back, his fists trembling. His home wasn't a home anymore, it was a stage for Corinne's empire. Downstairs, he began opening other rooms, each discovery fueling his anger. The library had become a meeting hall. His carefully arranged books were scattered, some used as coasters for wine glasses. The billiards room smelled of smoke. His private office, locked when he left, had been broken into. His computer sat on, files pulled up, financial statements, business records. She had pried into everything. A sound drew his attention, the faint creak of a door at the far end of the hall. He approached, slow and deliberate. Pushing it open, he found the media room. There, scattered across the couches, were HOA documents, sign-in sheets, and scribbled notes. His blood turned cold as he read them. HOA meeting notes, Ridgewood Estates. Attendance, Corinne President, Bill Treasurer, Susan Secretary, location, Mark's residence. They had been holding their meetings here, in his living room. Mark's mind raced. It wasn't just about Corinne moving in for comfort. She had weaponized his house. She had used it as the official headquarters of the HOA. His mansion wasn't just violated, it had been turned into a symbol of her dominance, a tool to further her control over the neighborhood. He picked up a glass still on the table, lipstick circling the rim, and hurled it against the wall. The shatter echoed through the room like thunder. Standing in the wreckage, he realized this was more than trespassing. It was a declaration of war. His eyes swept the room one last time. The wine, the papers, the clothes, it all painted the same picture. Corinne had invaded his life, blurred the line between authority and obsession, and tried to erase him from his own home. Mark exhaled slowly, forcing his rage into focus. She thought she had power. She thought she had humiliated him. But as he stood there, surrounded by the twisted remains of her invasion, Mark understood something vital. This wasn't the end of his ownership. It was the beginning of her downfall. Because unlike Corinne, Mark knew how to fight, and he was done playing by her rules. It started as murmurs. At first, Mark only caught fragments of conversations drifting across hedges and sidewalks, snippets from neighbors who quickly lowered their voices when he passed by. Words like donated, temporary arrangement, and community hub. The more he listened, the clearer it became. Corinne had spread a story through Ridgewood Estates, a lie so audacious it made Mark's stomach churn. She told anyone who would listen that Mark had generously offered his mansion to the HOA for use while he was away for business. According to her version, the board needed a suitable place for meetings, social gatherings, and administrative operations. She even said you wanted to give back to the community, one neighbor admitted sheepishly when Mark cornered him. I mean, she made it sound noble, like you volunteered it. We all thought. His voice trailed off, shame filling the silence. Mark could almost hear Corinne's smug tone as he pieced it together. She hadn't just stolen his home. She had rewritten the story so that he looked like the willing accomplice. Worse, some neighbors believed her. After all, Corinne had a talent for manipulation. She stood in cul-de-sacs with her manicured hands on her hips, repeating her rehearsed version of events until it became gospel. Mark wanted this, she'd insist. He told me so himself before leaving on his trip. We should all be grateful. And they were, at least some of them. For weeks, families had been parading through his mansion under the guise of community events. Potlucks were held in his dining room. Card games played in his library. Children ran across his backyard, trampling the flower beds he had planted years ago. Corinne basked in the glory, parading herself as the visionary leader who secured such a lavish donation. But not everyone was convinced. Whispers shifted. Doubts formed. The neighbors who had seen Mark's raw anger on the night of his return couldn't reconcile it with the tale Corinne told. and slowly, truth began to leak. "You didn't look like a man who volunteered his home," another resident told him in private. "When you came back and saw her there, you looked ready to tear the place apart. That wasn't the face of someone who agreed to this." Mark began gathering statements quietly, listening more than speaking. Piece by piece, the facade Karen had built was crumbling. The breaking point came at the next HOA meeting held, as always, in his living room. Mark showed up unannounced. The chatter fell to silence when he stepped inside. Karen, seated at the head of his table like a queen on her throne, froze mid-sentence. Mark didn't speak immediately. He simply walked to the head of the table, standing tall, the weight of the house itself behind him. Slowly, he placed a thick folder of documents on the table: title deeds, utility bills, ownership records, proof that the mansion was his and his alone. "You've all been told I donated this house," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Let me make something very clear. I did not. I never would. What Karen told you was a lie." Gasps rippled across the room. Karen's face tightened, but before she could interject, Mark continued. "She broke in. She squatted here. She hosted her parties, her meetings, and her little empire-building games in my home, and she made every one of you complicit by spinning her lies. She used me, and she used you." Karen slammed her palm on the table, her voice shrill. "That's not true. He's twisting this, he." But the neighbors weren't blind anymore. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others muttered. One elderly man spoke up. "Karen, you told us he offered it freely. If that's not true." Her composure cracked, the queenly confidence wavered, and in that moment Mark saw it, the mask slipping. The neighbors had begun to see her not as their leader, but as the fraud she truly was. Mark had learned one thing in business: never fight your enemies with just anger. Rage burned fast and hot, but evidence was a fire that consumed everything slowly, leaving no way out. And so, instead of yelling or throwing Karen out by force, Mark began building his case. First came the security cameras. Though Karen had unplugged the obvious ones, she'd overlooked the hidden backups, tiny wireless units embedded discreetly in the walls and smoke detectors. Mark had installed them years ago for peace of mind while traveling, and now they became his silent witnesses. He watched in cold fury as the footage played. Karen swanning through his hallways in his bathrobe, pouring vintage wine into crystal glasses, and hosting smug HOA meetings in his living room. Next were the utility records. The spikes were undeniable. Energy usage had doubled during the weeks she lived there. The pool heater, kept off when Mark traveled, had been running daily. His wine cellar cooling system, designed to preserve bottles worth more than some people's cars, had been overworked by constant raids. Even the grocery receipts told a story. Expensive food deliveries, all charged to his house account that Karen had somehow authorized. Then came the most damning evidence of all: the receipts Karen left behind. Careless in her arrogance, she had ordered catering, cleaners, and decorators, all under his address. Her signature appeared on invoices. Her handwriting scrawled notes like "bill to homeowner" or "community expense." Each scrap of paper was another nail in the coffin she didn't realize was being built around her. Mark gathered it all: videos, receipts, witness statements from neighbors who had finally admitted to attending community gatherings under false pretenses. He worked with a lawyer who specialized in property disputes, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire Winters who had shredded fraudulent HOA boards in court before. Claire was ruthless in her preparation. "We won't just evict her," she told Mark. "We'll expose her: fraud, trespassing, misrepresentation, abuse of position as an HOA officer. When we're finished, she won't just lose her seat on the board, she'll be facing charges." For the first time since discovering Karen in his home, Mark felt a strange calm. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. The next HOA meeting was unlike any before. Mark didn't arrive alone. He walked in with Claire at his side and a briefcase full of evidence. The neighbors, already whispering after last week's revelations, grew silent as the pair entered. Corinne was already seated, her forced smile brittle as glass. Mark set the briefcase on the table and opened it. One by one, he laid out photographs, receipts, utility reports, and printed transcripts from his security footage. Claire slid copies to each board member, her sharp gaze daring anyone to deny what they were reading. "This is what your president has been doing," Mark said evenly. "Not with her own resources, but with mine. She lied to you. She trespassed in my home. She spent money, utilities, and goods that didn't belong to her. She played queen while the rest of you bowed, but the crown she wore was stolen." Corinne's face went red. This is twisted. He's making this up." Claire cut her off smoothly. "The courts don't accept denial, Ms. Lane. They accept evidence, and we have more than enough to prove everything." The room shifted. Neighbors who had once clung to Corinne's words now looked at her with suspicion, even disgust. Some whispered angrily to each other. A few shook their heads. And then one man, Mr. Henley from 2 doors down, spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "She told us Mark gave her permission. She lied to all of us. We've been manipulated." Corinne's eyes darted around, desperate for support, but no one came to her rescue this time. Mark didn't need to raise his voice. He simply gathered the documents, closed the briefcase, and looked directly at her. "You thought you could steal from me. You thought you could steal my name, my home, and my reputation. But what you really stole," he said with quiet steel, "was time. And I'm done giving you any more of it." For the first time since he had known her, Corinne had no words. This wasn't the end. The courtroom awaited, but the balance of power had shifted. The HOA's self-proclaimed queen was cornered, and Mark had just shown everyone who truly ruled the board now. The community center was packed. Word had spread like wildfire that tonight's HOA meeting wouldn't be business as usual. People who normally skipped these gatherings showed up, squeezing into folding chairs, murmuring among themselves, waiting for the storm they sensed was about to break. Mark sat calmly at the front with Claire by his side, her laptop already connected to the projector. Corinne was at her usual spot at the head of the table, chin lifted high, lips pressed into a confident smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When the meeting was called to order, Corinne began in her usual commanding tone. "Before we get to business." Mark's voice cut through, steady and sharp. "Before you waste everyone's time, I have something the entire neighborhood deserves to see." Corinne turned toward him, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Turner, this is my meeting." But then the projector flickered to life. On the wall behind them, a video played. The image was crisp, the angle perfectly clear. Corinne herself, lounging on a pool chair beside his pool, wearing sunglasses and sipping from a bottle of champagne. She laughed with a group of friends, gesturing grandly as if she owned the place. A ripple of gasps swept across the room. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering. Someone muttered, "That's Mark's house." Corinne shot up from her seat. "This is taken out of context. He's twisting." Mark nodded to Claire, and another clip appeared. This one showed Corinne wandering into his private wine cellar, running her fingers along the bottles before pulling one down, opening it carelessly, and pouring glasses for her guests. The murmurs grew louder. Disbelief, anger, betrayal, it all buzzed through the room like electricity. Clip after clip rolled. Corinne hosting board meetings in his dining room, strutting through his hallways in his robe, children running wild through his backyard during so-called community gatherings. Each image was a nail driven deeper into her crumbling credibility. Finally Mark spoke, his voice calm but filled with iron. "You were told I donated my home to the HOA. You were told this was for your benefit. That was a lie. This is proof." Corinne's face flushed deep crimson. She pounded her fist on the table. "He's trying to ruin me. He's a liar. Don't you see what he's doing?" But her voice cracked under the weight of the evidence. Every time she tried to shout over him, Claire calmly switched to another photo, another invoice, another damning piece of proof. Receipts with her signature, deliveries billed to his address, utility records showing the spike during her stay. The crowd was no longer on her side. Neighbors who once nodded at her every word now glared with narrowed eyes. Some crossed their arms. Others whispered harshly among themselves. One woman stood up and snapped, "You told us he gave you permission, Karen. You made us complicit in this." Karen's mouth opened, then shut again. For the first time she faltered. Mark didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply closed his folder and looked directly at the board. "This is the person who has been running your HOA, someone who lies, someone who steals, someone who manipulates you for her own gain. You deserve better." Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then slowly people began to clap. It started hesitant, then grew, until nearly the whole room was applauding. Not wildly, not celebratory, but in solidarity, in agreement that the truth was undeniable. Karen stood frozen, her so-called reign crumbling in front of the very people she once ruled. The humiliation was complete. And yet Mark knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of her fall. The courtroom still awaited, and there, the humiliation would become something far worse. The morning after the explosive HOA meeting, the neighborhood was buzzing. Conversations that had once revolved around landscaping rules and parking permits now centered on one thing: Karen Lane. Her name was whispered at mailboxes, muttered on morning walks, and traded like gossip over back fences. For years she had been untouchable, the self-appointed queen of Ridgewood Estates. But after last night, her crown was tarnished beyond repair. Mark knew it was only a matter of time before the law caught up with her. He hadn't just handed his evidence to the HOA board. He'd given copies to the police and the county prosecutor. Claire, his lawyer, had made sure every scrap of proof was neatly packaged, cross-referenced, and undeniable. There would be no loopholes for Karen to wriggle through. 2 days later, the flashing lights returned to Ridgewood. Only this time, they weren't aimed at Mark's gate. Neighbors stepped out onto porches and sidewalks as the cruisers pulled up in front of Karen's home. The once pristine lawn, trimmed to perfection, now looked neglected, an outward reflection of the chaos brewing inside. Officers knocked firmly, and when Karen opened the door, her shrill voice carried down the street. "This is harassment. I am the president of this community. You can't do this," she screeched. But the officers didn't flinch. One read the charges aloud: trespassing, fraud, misrepresentation, and misuse of HOA funds. Each word seemed to hit her like a stone, stripping away the authority she had clung to for so long. When the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the neighborhood seemed to exhale as one. Karen fought to maintain her image, lifting her chin high even as the officers guided her down the walkway. "This is a mistake. I was acting in the best interest of the community. You'll all regret siding with him." Her voice cracked, the shrill edge betraying panic. Some neighbors turned away, embarrassed for her. Others watched with grim satisfaction. A few even filmed the moment on their phones, capturing the HOA president being escorted away in disgrace. Mark stood at a distance, arms folded across his chest. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply watched. For him, this wasn't about enjoying her humiliation. It was about justice finally being served. Karen was loaded into the back of the cruiser, still shouting about community rights and her authority. The door shut with a final metallic slam, muffling her protests. The convoy of flashing lights pulled away, leaving only silence and the stunned expressions of her once loyal supporters. Within hours, news spread beyond Ridgewood Estates. Local outlets picked up the story. HOA president arrested for fraud and trespassing. Photos of her in handcuffs hit social media, shared and reshared by residents who had endured her tyranny for years. And while Karen sat in a holding cell, Mark met again with Claire, already preparing for the civil suits that would follow. Restitution for the damages, accountability for the stolen funds, protection for the residents who had been bullied into silence for so long. The Queen of Ridgewood was gone. The empire she built on intimidation and lies was crumbling. For the first time in years, the community began to feel something they thought they had lost forever. Relief. The weeks following Corinne's arrest were like a storm's aftermath. The neighborhood, once ruled by intimidation and constant fear of fines, now stood in a strange silence. For the first time in years, residents gathered not in hushed secrecy but in open conversation. The spell Corinne had woven, the illusion of her absolute control, was broken. The HOA board, stripped of their figurehead, scrambled to maintain order. But without Corinne's iron grip, they were exposed for what they were: complicit, timid, and powerless. Some resigned quietly, slipping out of positions they had only ever held because Corinne demanded loyalty. Others begged forgiveness, claiming they had been trapped under her rule. The truth was clear: change was inevitable. It was Claire, Mark's lawyer, who first suggested it. "You've proven yourself capable, Mark. The neighbors look to you now. If you want lasting peace, you can't just be the man who took Corinne down. You have to be the one who rebuilds." Mark resisted at first. He had never cared for neighborhood politics, never wanted to be in the business of rulebooks and committee meetings. But when he looked around and saw the relief in his neighbor's eyes, he realized Claire was right. People trusted him now, and trust, once lost, was fragile. If the HOA was to survive, it needed leadership that wasn't corrupted by power. The vote came sooner than expected. A special election was called, and the turnout was the largest anyone could remember. Families who had avoided meetings out of fear now showed up in full force. The atmosphere was different: hopeful, energized, even celebratory. Mark's name dominated the ballots. When the results were announced, cheers erupted in the community center. Children clapped, parents smiled, and even some of the former board members looked relieved. Mark was the new HOA president, not because he sought power, but because he had earned respect. His first act was symbolic but powerful. Standing at the front of the meeting hall, he tore up the thick binder of arbitrary fines and oppressive rules Corinne had created. "This community isn't about control," he said firmly. "It's about trust, respect, and neighbors looking out for one another. Starting today, we live like that again." The applause that followed shook the walls. Corinne's fate, meanwhile, was sealed. The court ordered restitution and barred her from stepping foot in Ridgewood Estates ever again. Her mansion-like persona was shattered, her so-called kingdom stripped from her forever. Once the self-proclaimed queen, she was now just a cautionary tale whispered about in nearby towns. For Mark, the victory wasn't about titles or positions. It was about reclaiming his life, his home, and his peace. The mansion on the hill was his once more, not a stage for Corinne's charades, but a sanctuary he had fought to protect. As weeks turned into months, Ridgewood began to change. Neighbors who once avoided each other now shared cookouts. Yards once inspected with suspicion were admired with genuine compliments. Children laughed in the streets without parents fearing fines for noise violations. And from his study overlooking the neighborhood, Mark finally felt what he had been missing since the day he drove home early from his business trip. Control. Not over others, but over his own life. The HOA hadn't just lost Corinne. It had gained something greater: freedom.